Hello and welcome to week one of Introduction to Psychology. I'm very excited for this class. I hope you guys are too. So, just to kind of give you a general background, for this class, we're going to be taking a biopsychosocial approach to studying psychology. It's the only way to really approach it because we can't understand people if we don't understand how the body works and how the body is influencing the brain and how our genetics are associated with our personality and brain structure, for example. We're not going to understand people unless we can understand the brain structure and then how people think and how people behave. And we're not going to understand any of that unless we understand things in the social context. So you're going to be hearing a lot of variables like race and sex and gender and sexual orientation. And we're going to be looking at how forms of stratification and prejudice and discrimination influence you. And we're going to be looking at things like how is poverty associated with intelligence? How is poverty associated with fulfilling, your overall potential as a human, okay? So throughout this class, you're going to hear us talking beyond the scope of psychology, but it's all going to be kind of wrapped around understanding how individuals work. Sociology is concerned with more how groups work, okay? But you can't understand how groups works without understanding the individual, and you can't understand an individual without understanding the influence of the group, and you can't understand any of that if you don't understand biology in the way the human body works, the human brain functions, okay? Because our body is incredibly associated with our behavior. Just think about it. When you get hungry, what happens? Your body releases hormones. The hormones travel through the bloodstream to the brain, which then signal the brain that you're hungry. Your brain then tells your body to move your legs to go find food, etc. So again, how biology influences the brain and behavior and how the social context influences the brain and behavior. That's the approach we're going to take to this class, okay? But when we are studying psychology, again, our level of analysis is the individual, and we're really concerned with the brain structure and then cognitions. All of that includes emotion and personality and identity and behavior, of course, okay? That's all just a big part of it, okay? So, what is psychology? So, psychology is the science of behavior and mental processes, okay? It's the structure of the brain, cognitions, emotions, personalities, all those things I just listed, okay? So, we're going to be thinking about all kinds of different variables, and the goal is to try to kind of put them all together so we can understand how people work, okay? Some fun questions for this class. For example, are our genes associated with our brain structure, cognitions, emotions, and behavior? Think about it. Are you a little bit like somebody in your family? Did you turn out, 25% like your parents? Do you have a sibling that you turned out 25% like? Okay. So, yes, genes are associated with our behavior. Are genetics associated with identifying as homosexual? Absolutely. Genetics are associated with our sexuality. Are genetics associated with our personality, the way we think, the way we behave? Yes. We need to understand genetics, hence the biological processes, okay? Another question. How has society shaped our brain structure, cognitions, emotions, and behavior? Think about it. How does society shape the lives of men and women? Men and women are socialized to, take on specific gender roles. Girls are encouraged to be nurturing, and boys are encouraged to be aggressive. Girls are encouraged to be homemakers, and boys are encouraged to go out and work, okay? This is the idea of traditional versus egalitarian values. The traditional values, again, being woman as homemaker, man as breadwinner. But in modern times, we've turned that on its head. And what you're starting to see now is these more egalitarian attitudes where gender roles are kind of being dismissed and women are entering fields that were primarily dominated by men and men are entering fields that were dominated by women, for example. However, are there stigmas attached to that still? Are there stigmas attached to a stay-at-home dad, for example? Okay, how does this socialization of telling women that you should stay home with the kids, how does that affect the way women think? How does that affect their attitudes, ideologies, and beliefs? Think about the culture of male and the culture of female. Do they differ? And because the culture differ, does that influence the way we think and behave in our ideology overall? Just think about American culture. Do Americans behave and think a little bit differently than people in different countries, for example, based upon our culture? Is our behavior influenced by our race? Does identifying as black versus identifying as Asian influence the way you behave, you think, the way you spend your time? Is there an association between race and the language that you use? So again, we need to be constantly thinking about how society influences us, how it influences the way we think, how it influences our prejudice and our discrimination, our attitudes and our beliefs and our value systems, for example. Okay? More good questions. How are humans the same? And how are we different? That's kind of what I'm talking about. Is there a genetic difference between men and women? And does these biological differences between men and women, does that come together to suggest that the brains of men operate differently than the brains of women? And again, this is where we start to get into these great debates, okay? Because how much of differences between men and women are based upon genetics? And how much of differences between men and women are based upon how men and women are socialized in the social context, and how much of differences are based upon the brain itself and cognitions. Okay, so I want you guys to be thinking about this stuff. Another good fun question: why do we dream? What's up with that? How much of you is driven by your unconscious, and how much of you is your consciousness? Think about when you're driving a car. You ever find that you didn't pay attention for a few minutes? Well, when you weren't paying attention, who was driving the car? Your unconsciousness has the power to put you to sleep. So who's really in control? Your cells in your body or you and your consciousness? Things to be thinking about. What goes on in the mind of a baby? How does a baby think? Is a baby thinking in images and pictures and language? Why is it that you don't really have any memories before age 3? Is that because the way the baby was thinking and the way that the baby categorized information is now different than the way you categorize information once you learn language? Therefore, all those memory cues that babies had are therefore lost? You know, but yet they have memories of their parents and other people in their life, for example. But again, what goes on in the mind of a baby? Things we'll be talking about. Are some people smarter than other people? And this is what really breaks you because, again, the education system, the school you went to, the neighborhood you went to, your parents' socioeconomic status, that's associated with your ability to score well on an intelligence test. But what are intelligence tests actually measuring? What are they testing? Does your ability to do better than somebody else on an intelligence test mean that you're smarter than that person? Or does that just mean that you went to a better school? So again, when we start talking about intelligence, we need to be critiquing intelligence tests and asking really big questions. But the sad thing is there is a correlation between things like brain activity and the type of school you went to. And so again, this kind of gets into inequality because not every child has the same chance as everybody else. What's the biggest factor when it comes to intelligence? Food, nourishment. So what happens to a poor child who was undernourished? How is that affecting their development and their overall cognitive ability and their ability to score well on an intelligence test, for example? Okay, just stuff we're going to be talking about in this class. So why is psychology a science? Again, we're trying to apply an empirical approach using this scientific method, a standardized approach to being able to study people that is evidence-based, that follows the scientific method of observation, experimentation, and critical thinking. Okay, so what does any science have in common? And that's this. It's this open, standardized, approach. And that's the goal of psychology. When we get into research methods a little bit later, we'll talk about how we really approach these methods to make it empirical, but I won't get you with that now. So the book gives a general introduction, and then it starts talking about some of the early thinkers and where does psychology come from. Okay, so a lot of early psychology comes out of basic philosophy, trying to understand the mind and reason and how the brain works, and things like that. So some of your early philosophers like Locke, Plato, Descartes, they're pondering the nature of life, the nature of humanity, the nature of logic, things like that. Okay. But then along comes Wilhelm Wundt in the late 1800s, and this is where modern psychology really begins. Okay. Wundt comes along, he introduces structuralism, and he's the first to really start to apply scientific methods to examine what's going on in your mind. Okay. So structuralism with Wundt and Titchener, they applied introspection to understand what's going on in the mind. The goal of introspection is to ask sensory questions, like when you smell a rose, what's happening? They're trying to understand consciousness, okay? So they're observing mental and emotional processes through is used by applying introspection to ask questions to figure things out, okay? But then along comes Williams James, and he's like, instead of really kind of asking questions about sensation, maybe we should start talking about what's going on with the actual brain structure of itself. And, what purpose does consciousness have, for example, okay? So then along comes behavioralism, and they kind of reject the idea of studying conscious. Behaviorism is much more interested in looking at stimulus response, looking at how our behavior is conditioned, trying to figure out how we learn about life and society and how our brains grow, okay? So Skinner and Pavlov are some of the main proponents of that. Then along comes psychoanalytic theory with Sigmund Freud. The goal of Freud is to understand the unconscious mind, human development, and the inner parts of your mind, like the id, ego, and the superego. Your inner self, your id, your superego is your social self, and the ego kind of moderates between the two. Think about that voice in your head when you're talking to yourself, and your inner desires are talking, and your mind is like, no, we can't let that out, and so that's kind of the id, ego, and superego, that conversation you're having in your mind, okay? And then humanistic theory is another early theory where the goal is really just to be positive and focus on human potential and fulfilling what we're meant to do and finding meaning in life, becoming self-actualized, and then finding the meaning, okay? So again, these are the early theories. We're going to do an entire chapter on behaviorism, psychoanalytic theory, and Freud's going to come up throughout the class. Humanistic theory, especially like positive psychology, for example, is going to also come up. Functionalism and structuralism, they have evolved over time. So now it's kind of structural functionalism. So structural functionalist theory, talking about how the structures, have a purpose and each part of the brain serves a purpose, for example. That has all kind of modernized into neuroscience and cognitive psychology. So those we're not going to talk about too much in this class, but you just need to know, some of the early people. So again, you need to know Wundt, structuralism, and the laboratory first lab. You have James in functionalism, Skinner and Pavlov for behaviorism, Freud for psychoanalytic theory, Maslow and Rogers for humanistic theory, okay? So your modern theories are cognitive psychology, and this is really focusing on, cognitions, thoughts. Then you have cognitive neuroscience, the structure of the brain and how that influences thoughts. Evolutionary psychology, discussing how human behavior, traits, personalities have evolved over, millennia. Okay, and then so how much of our behavior is just evolutionary adaptations, for example. We have positive psychology. Again, that's the idea of fulfilling your potential, self-actualization, becoming the person you were meant to be, finding meaning. It's a holistic approach, meaning more than the sum of its parts. You need to know how everything interacts with everything to understand how the whole works. Biopsychosocial approach, which is really what we're going to focus on in this class, applying biology, psychology, and sociocultural variables to understand the person, the individual. And then social psychology, the combination of, basic psychology, the brain and cognition, along with the social context, okay? We are going to talk a bit about developmental psychology, which is now lifespan psychology, and a couple other theories also throughout this class, okay? So the book starts introducing research methods a little bit here. It says basic research is for seeking out knowledge, and applied research is for seeking out problem solving. Okay, so when we get to research methods, you'll always ask the question, is it basic or is it applied? Are we just trying to get knowledge for knowledge's sake, or are we trying to get knowledge so that we can apply it to solve problems? Okay, so some jobs in psychology, counseling psychology, again, applying therapy. Same with clinical psychology. Psychiatry is really using medicine. Community psychology, going out and working with the public. A lot of areas of psychology. We'll get a little bit into that more later for you, though. So real quick on the scientific method. So the book gives your basic approach to research. Again, our goal is theory seeking, using theories to, developing theories from the research and then applying the theories to understand more research. So a theory is evidence-based explanations. You have our hypothesis, which are just, our predictions. You have our operational definitions, which is exhaustively defining what it is you are trying to study. You have replication. Is the study reproducible? Okay. The book talks a little bit about sampling in chapter 1. How is it that we go out and find participants from our study? The book introduces random sampling, opening up a phone book, choosing every 10th person, for example, so that the sample for your study is representative of the entire group, the population. So a population is the whole group that you're studying, and a sample is the part of the group that you're studying to make inferences, generalizations about the whole group, okay? So for research methods, you have quantitative and qualitative research. Quantitative is using numbers like statistics. Qualitative is using non-numbers like surveys to go out and ask their questions. Now, again, a lot of surveys can be coded, but a lot of surveys are open-ended. So they can't always be coded numerically. We might have to code them based upon thematics, okay? So the book talks about a couple of different approaches to the social sciences and how we can do research. You have case studies, which is just going out and studying an individual or a specific group. Naturalistic observations, going out and doing field research and observing like a classroom, for example, and examining social interaction. You have surveys, which are questionnaires. The goal of those is to look for correlations, associated variables. We have experiments, which is using it in a controlled environment. You have an experimental group, you have a control group, you have independent variables and dependent variables, and then you're trying to examine whether the independent variable has influences on the dependent variable. Experiments require a controlled environment. That in sociology is very hard, but in psychology, it's a little bit easier to pull off. So we do use a lot of experimentation in psychology, which is one real added benefit, that we can go out and really do these controlled experiments, because then we can talk about causation. More than just associations and correlations, we can talk about causation, okay? So that's just a quick approach to research methods. And then whenever you're doing research in psychology, we need to be considerate of ethics. So we need to always get informed consent from our participants, make sure that they approve of us doing the study. We need to debrief them afterwards. We need institutional review board protection. So that means all studies need to go through a review board to be signed off and approved, for example. And then we all need to be following our codes of conduct. So the conduct for committee, is very clearly stated in the American Psychological Association or American Sociological Association, or the medical field. They all have different codes of ethics, but science is very clearly guided by our ethics. We always need to be focusing on them, specifically not causing harm, things like that, confidentiality, anonymity, etc. So that's the first lecture. Real quick, let's go over what's going on for this week. So when you guys go into this week, you'll go to home. Hopefully you guys have already worked through all the Start Here information. You've read the syllabus, you've looked at the course outlines, you're comfortable with what's happening in the class. So again, for every week, you'll have your week, whatever's due for that week, which again is also in your Start Here under course outline and due dates, but then I've repeated it here for you just in case you don't know. So this week, you guys will need to complete discussion 1 by Sunday at 11:59, and you'll need to have completed quiz 1 by Sunday at 11:59, okay? You'll have read for this week. Oh, I'm so sorry. For this week, you guys will have read chapter 1. So again, it tells you what your reading is right here. And then here under your lecture, this is where you found your lecture in the PowerPoint. Here's your discussion for week 1. So you guys will open up discussion 1, read the instructions, and follow through it very carefully. You're going to need to reply to the initial discussion with 200 to 400 words. Then you're going to be replying to 2 other students in approximately 100 words, okay? So the first discussion, so that just needs to be done by Sunday. And then here's your quiz. And then if you guys open up your quiz, it'll pop up the quiz for you. So when you guys go to do this, there are 10-point quizzes, true, false, multiple choice, some open-ended questions. So you'll go to preview, you'll look through, and that's going to be your quiz for you guys. And when you're done with that, just submit the quiz, and you guys should be all good. Okay. If you have any questions, please email me, and have a wonderful week. Enjoy the discussions. Definitely get involved with those. That really helps us to be able to exchange ideas. So have a great time with that, interacting with your students and with me. Thank you so much and have a great day.